In the summer of 1943, American soldiers were running out of bullets, not because the enemy had captured supply ships, not because submarines had sunk the transports. They were running out because America, the mightiest industrial nation on Earth, simply could not make ammunition fast enough. Marines in the Solomon Islands were rationing rifle rounds. Infantry units in Sicily were reducing training fire because they feared they wouldn't have enough for actual combat. Platoon leaders were writing home, begging families to petition their congressmen for more ammunition. It sounds impossible, almost absurd, but those letters existed. The crisis was real, and it was getting worse by the day. The War Department estimated that to sustain operations in both the Pacific and the Mediterranean, American factories needed to produce roughly 2.4 billion rounds of ammunition every single month. Actual output was barely half that number. The gap represented firefights lost, hills abandoned, lives spent because the greatest industrial power in history couldn't solve a production bottleneck that had plagued ammunition plants since the First World War. And then a 19-year-old girl who had been working at the Lake City Ordnance Plant outside Independence, Missouri for just 12 weeks noticed something that trained engineers had missed for decades. She saw a pattern in the movement of human hands, a rhythm that reminded her of something from a history textbook, a machine from the Civil War that had solved a similar problem in a completely different context. What happened next would double the plant's daily output, ripple across every ammunition factory in America, and help ensure that by D-Day, the men hitting those beaches would never run short of the bullets they needed to survive. This is the story of the women who built the bullets. The mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives who flooded into factories when the men shipped overseas. The forgotten army of the home front, who won the war not with rifles and grenades, but with brass and steel and hands that bled from repetitive motion. And it's the story of how one young woman's observation, born in a moment of frustration on a sweltering factory floor, became a mechanical innovation that changed the mathematics of American firepower. At 7:10 in the morning on a humid July day in 1943, the Lake City Ordnance Plant was already shaking under the weight of its own machines. Rows of stamping presses hammered brass into cartridge cups. Heat radiated from annealing furnaces. Conveyor belts clattered. The air carried a metallic smell mixed with oil and sweat. Supervisors carried pocket thermometers that routinely showed temperatures pushing 97 degrees. The human body adapted out of necessity, not preference. No one complained. Complaining didn't add brass to the belts. Complaining didn't move the war a minute closer to ending. The plant employed thousands of workers, most of them women who had never seen the inside of a factory before 1942. They came from farms and shops and kitchens. They learned to operate machinery that could crush a hand in an instant. They worked 12-hour shifts in heat that would shut down a modern office building, and they produced ammunition at rates that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. But it still wasn't enough. The problem was the feeder station, the most delicate part of the entire operation. This was where raw brass casings had to be fed into alignment tracks before charging and crimping. It was still done by human hands, working in a repetitive pattern that had not changed since 1918. 6 women gathered at the feeder table, arms moving in tight loops. Pick, place, slide. Pick, place, slide. 3 motions repeated thousands of times each hour. The plant hoped for 30,000 fed casings every hour on each line, but on most days production stalled at 23,000. The difference, when scaled across the entire facility, meant millions of missing rounds every 24 hours. One broken fingernail, one slip, one jammed guide rail, and the entire sequence froze. The real enemy inside a wartime plant was not sabotage or defective metal. It was seconds. Lost seconds. Every stoppage meant recalibration. Every recalibration meant lost output. Somewhere in the Pacific, a Marine machine gun crew was firing faster than Lake City could replenish. At 7:26 that morning, a guide rail snapped loose and a spill of casings scattered across the floor. Production stopped. A red warning lamp flashed overhead. Supervisors sprinted in. Mechanics pushed carts. The women stepped back, wiping sweat from their foreheads. They knew the drill. Another 10 minutes lost. Another chunk missing from the daily quota. Among the workers gathering the spilled casings was a 19-year-old named Evelyn Carter. She had started at Lake City only 12 weeks earlier, learning the rhythms of the plant the way a new sailor learns the pitch and roll of a ship. She watched supervisors frown at production charts. She overheard engineers muttering about bottlenecks. And as she knelt on that concrete floor, picking up scattered brass, something odd tugged at her attention. The pattern of the women's hands, the rhythm, the looping motion of wrists and shoulders. It was circular, predictable, mechanical in its own way. She hesitated, watching the motion repeat as the workers resumed. Pick, place, slide. An orbit rather than a line. And suddenly she remembered something from a high school history textbook. A machine that spun to feed something faster than human hands could ever manage. A rotating pattern, multiple stations sharing the load. A circular platform that moved items from hand to hand. Something that fed endlessly as long as the wheel kept turning. Evelyn tried to shake the thought off. It was absurd. She was no engineer, just a teenager earning 80 cents an hour. But the idea would not leave. A rotating system could eliminate the start-stop rhythm of human motion. A wheel, not a line. A ring of feeders instead of a row. Efficiency gained not by forcing workers to move faster, but by letting the machine carry the motion for them. She remembered the name now. Gatling, the old multi-barreled gun from the Civil War that increased firing rate by rotating barrels instead of demanding one barrel cool down between shots. What if feeding ammunition worked the same way but in reverse? What if rotation could solve the bottleneck that linear motion couldn't? At 9:11 that morning, after the briefing dissolved into the usual thunder of machinery, she stood beside line 4 again and felt the strange insistence of the idea that had been tugging at her since dawn. She watched 6 pairs of hands repeating the same circular path, the same choreography of fatigue. Reach, lift, set, withdraw, over and over, a loop disguised as a line. And then her breath caught, not because she understood the solution fully, but because she suddenly saw the shape, a wheel, a rotating carrier, a principle that had existed for nearly 80 years, yet no one here seemed to notice. At 9:23, she slipped away from the line when the foreman turned his back and walked toward a scrap bin near the east wall. It was filled with broken pallets, bent metal brackets, discarded wooden slats, and a dozen objects whose purpose had been forgotten. She picked through the pile, feeling the coarse grain of old pine boards, the rough ends of cut dowels, the cold rim of a discarded bearing ring. She didn't know exactly what she needed, but she knew she needed something circular, something that could turn without binding, something that could carry weight but not collapse under vibration. She ducked behind a stack of crates near the maintenance shed and began assembling a rough outline on the concrete floor. She arranged 3 wooden slats in a triangle, then 6 in a star, then 8. She tested how the slats might rotate around the bearing ring, trying to visualize ammunition casings sitting in small recesses along the edges. Her fingers trembled from the absurdity of the attempt. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be inventing anything. But the urgency of the idea overpowered any concern for protocol. At 9:31, a mechanic emerged from the maintenance shed and froze when he saw her kneeling on the floor with a ring and stray lumber arranged in a strange geometric pattern. He raised an eyebrow. She blurted out an explanation that even she didn't fully understand. A conveyor that rotated, a circular motion that redistributed load, a pattern inspired by a multi-barreled gun whose name escaped her at that moment. The mechanic listened, skeptical but amused. Then he surprised her. He didn't laugh. Instead, he asked quietly, "What problem are you actually trying to solve?" And when she answered throughput, he nodded. Throughput was a language everyone at Lake City spoke. At 9:42, she went to a small drafting table near the supervisor's office and drew the rough design with a stub of dull pencil. A central ring, a rotating plate, peripheral slots angled to cradle casings, a mechanical linkage connecting the rotation to the existing conveyor belt motor. She didn't know the torque requirements or the exact alignment specs, but she knew the most important variable, frequency. If the wheel rotated 9 times per minute, each revolution could feed roughly 1,000 casings, multiply by 60 minutes, and the line could exceed 60,000 units per hour. Multiply by 4 wheels per line, and the number ballooned again. At 11:22, under the sour smell of coolant and brass dust, the maintenance crew cleared a narrow space beside Line 2 for a test. They did not shut the line down. No one would dare risk the quota for an experiment dreamed up by a 19-year-old with a sketch on scrap paper. They simply carved out a pocket of floor where a small wooden mock-up could spin without injuring anyone if it shattered. A half-circle of workers gathered, some curious, some skeptical, all exhausted. The foreman glanced at his watch. The test had exactly 3 minutes, not 4, not 5. Lunch break wasn't until noon, and the war did not pause to indulge ideas. Evelyn set the crude wooden wheel onto a temporary spindle the mechanic had bolted to a bench. The wheel wobbled before it even turned. The slats were uneven, the bearing ring too loose, but it didn't matter. This was not a prototype. This was proof of motion. The mechanic attached a small belt from a discarded motor. He flipped the switch. The wheel jerked, hesitated, then spun with a trembling, jittery rhythm. She placed 3 casings into the shallow recesses she had carved with a pocket knife. The wheel rotated. 1 casing fed correctly into the alignment channel. Another bounced out. The third shot across the bench and clattered onto the concrete floor, spinning like a doomed coin. The workers burst into laughter. Not cruel, just tired, just honest. The wheel was too light, too fast, too uneven. It scattered metal like a toddler tossing marbles. The foreman shook his head and restarted the stopwatch. 2 minutes left. Evelyn adjusted the recesses with her thumb. She slowed the motor by tightening the belt. The second rotation delivered 1 casing properly and 1 half jammed. The third bounced out entirely. A pattern was emerging, but not the one she had hoped for. The idea wasn't wrong. The build was. At 11:25, the foreman said time was up, but something unexpected happened. The mechanic who had helped her earlier stepped forward and said, "Wait, 1 more rotation." The foreman let the clock run. The mechanic steadied the wheel with both hands, adjusting the tension, lowering the speed, until the rotation resembled the slow, methodical sweep of a lighthouse beam. Evelyn placed 3 more casings. The wheel turned. 1 casing fed cleanly. The second slid halfway but corrected itself at the guide lip. The third wobbled but fell exactly where it needed to. A small ripple of surprise moved through the circle of workers. It wasn't success, not yet, but it was motion that made sense, motion that could be refined. At 11:35, an older woman from Line 4 approached her quietly, the same woman who had patted her shoulder earlier that morning. She said nothing at first. She simply set a casing into Evelyn's hand and pointed at the faint dent along its rim. "You see that?" she asked. That's from fatigue. Repetition does that. To metal. To people. She looked toward the wooden wheel, still sitting crooked on the bench. Anything that reduces that repetition is worth trying. At 12:47, long after most workers had returned from lunch and the heat inside the plant had crept back into the unbearable range, the foreman called Evelyn to the supervisor's platform overlooking the main assembly hall. She climbed the metal stairs with the uneasy feeling of someone expecting reprimand, not recognition. On the platform stood 3 people who did not belong to the routine of Lake City: a procurement officer from the ordnance department, a plant engineer with grease still on his sleeves, and the mechanic who had helped her steady the shaky wooden wheel. All 3 were staring at her sketch, spread out across the supervisor's desk and weighted down with brass casings. The engineer asked her to explain the concept again. She tried, stumbling at first, then finding her rhythm. Rotational feed reduced manual transfer, a system that redistributed work across a circular motion rather than a linear one. She pointed to her revised drawing with hands that trembled from equal parts fear and adrenaline. The engineer listened without interrupting, which unnerved her even more. When she finished, he tapped the margin where she had added a second wheel. He asked why. She answered honestly, because one wheel could feed continuously only if the next one was already reloading itself. A staggered rotation meant no empty cycles, no pauses, no dead time. If a full system ran at 9 revolutions per minute with 6 slots per wheel, and if 3 wheels were synchronized, the theoretical throughput approached 100,000 casings per hour. The engineer's voice flattened into something she had never heard from him before. Something like respect. Not belief, not yet, but respect for the logic. At 1300 hours, the procurement officer made a decision that Evelyn would only understand fully months later. He authorized the maintenance crew to build a steel prototype during the night shift. At 1940 that night, long after the day shift had vanished into the Missouri darkness, the maintenance bay glowed under harsh white lamps. Sparks showered from welding torches, steel rang under hammers. The first real prototype, no wood, no wobble, no guesswork, took shape on a heavy workbench that smelled of oil and heat. The mechanic carefully lowered the new wheel onto a hardened spindle machined only an hour earlier. The plate was nearly 28 inches across, cut from quarter-inch steel, with a stabilizing ring welded around the outer edge. Each slot was lined with rubber scavenged from vehicle tires to absorb vibration. The wheel was heavier than expected, heavy enough that one man could barely lift it without losing his grip. That weight mattered. In this plant, vibration killed ideas faster than heat. At 20:03, the engineer checked the gear reduction assembly connected to an old motor salvaged from a conveyor line. If the rotation was too fast, the casings would fly. Too slow, and the system would be pointless. He adjusted the tension rod, then stepped back. "Ready?" he said quietly. The mechanic flipped the switch. The motor growled. The wheel shuddered once, then began turning in a smooth, steady arc. Not perfect, but controlled. A low hum, not a rattling death rattle. The crew exchanged a look. It was working, or at least not failing instantly. 20 casings placed into the recesses. The wheel rotated. The casings stayed put. One by one, they reached the feed lip and dropped into the alignment chute exactly as intended. The first 10 fell cleanly. The next few bounced slightly but landed where they needed to. One jammed momentarily, then righted itself. Only one fell outside the chute entirely. That ratio, 19:1, did not sound revolutionary, but compared to the chaos of the wooden mock-up earlier that day, it was staggering. At 6:50 the next morning, the plant whistle screamed over the parking lot as sunlight cut through the haze above the smokestacks. Workers streamed in, unaware that a piece of steel assembled overnight was about to tilt their entire world. At the center of Line 2 stood the new rotating feeder, bolted into place, polished only enough to keep sharp edges from cutting hands. It looked crude, heavy, overbuilt. No one would have guessed it might change the trajectory of a factory producing more ammunition than any other plant on the continent. At 7:11, the switch snapped. The feeder wheel stirred, rotated, steadied, and began its slow heartbeat. Not the frantic spin of the wooden mock-up, not the trembling imbalance of the overnight build. A steady, deliberate motion. The workers leaned in. One fed the first casings onto the recesses. The wheel carried them forward, and then something remarkable happened. Instead of a handful of casings being aligned one by one, the wheel delivered an entire cluster with a rhythm that felt almost unnatural for this plant. No jam, no hesitation, no stop-start stutter. The typical feed rate was under 500 casings per minute on this station. That morning, the counter kicked past 700, then 740, then 783. The increase wasn't theoretical anymore, it was audible. The alignment channels rattled faster, the workers' hands moved with less strain. The entire line seemed to exhale as if someone had loosened a knot in its spine. At 7:44, as if summoned by fate, the production counter hit an impossible number. A full hour's worth of output reached a threshold Lake City had never achieved at this hour. 80,000 casings. The workers froze for a moment, staring at the counter as if it were lying. Then the room erupted, not in cheers, this was a war plant after all, but in a kind of stunned electric silence. A silence that meant everyone understood they had just crossed into new territory. The superintendent authorized immediate fabrication of 3 additional units, a full-scale redesign of Line 2, a phased conversion of the remaining lines if results held for 72 hours. A memo went to Washington noting an experimental increase in feeder efficiency. No names, no credit, just numbers, the only language wartime bureaucracy trusted. Within 6 months, the rotating feeder system had spread to every major ammunition plant in America. The design was refined, strengthened, improved by engineers who understood metallurgy and torque better than a 19-year-old could. But the core principle remained unchanged: rotation instead of linear motion, a wheel instead of a line, a system that worked with human fatigue rather than against it. By D-Day, American factories were producing ammunition at rates that would have seemed impossible in 1943. The men who hit the beaches of Normandy never ran short of bullets. The Marines who fought their way across the Pacific fired their weapons without rationing rounds. The aerial gunners who defended bomber formations over Germany emptied their belts knowing that more ammunition was on the way. None of them knew that their firepower depended partly on an observation made by a teenage girl on a sweltering factory floor in Missouri. The women who built the bullets never received medals. They were not mentioned in history books or celebrated in victory parades. When the war ended, they were expected to return to kitchens and nurseries, to pretend that the years of grueling labor had been merely an interruption rather than a transformation. Many of them never spoke about what they had done. The calluses on their hands healed. The memories faded into the background noise of peacetime life. But they had won the war as surely as any soldier. They had stood at machines that could crush them in an instant. They had worked shifts that would be illegal today. They had solved problems that baffled engineers. And when the numbers didn't add up, when the quotas couldn't be met, when the margin between victory and defeat came down to casings per hour, they found a way. Evelyn Carter returned to civilian life after the war. She married, raised children, lived quietly in a suburb where no one knew that she had once sketched a mechanical diagram that changed the output of American ammunition production. Her name appears in no official records. Her contribution was absorbed into the anonymous machinery of industrial triumph. She was one of millions of women who served on the home front, invisible and essential. But her story matters because it represents something larger than herself. It represents the truth that innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or boardrooms. Sometimes it comes from the people closest to the problem, the workers who feel the rhythm of a broken system in their own exhausted hands. Sometimes the most important ideas emerge from frustration rather than inspiration, from necessity rather than genius. The mothers and grandmothers who worked those factory floors understood something that comfortable peacetime can make us forget, that wars are won not by armies alone, but by the endless accumulation of small improvements, each one seeming insignificant until you add them all together. A few seconds saved at each station, a handful multiplied by hundreds of workers, scaled across 12 lines, scaled across 24 hours, scaled across the years of a global conflict. That was America's secret weapon, not just industrial capacity, but the willingness to let anyone contribute, to listen when a teenager said she had an idea, to test a sketch made on packing paper, to believe that the answer might come from the most unexpected source. The women who built the bullets proved that the arsenal of democracy was not built by a few great men, but by millions of ordinary people who refused to accept that the numbers couldn't be changed. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be honored, and their story deserves to be told to every generation that follows, so that we never forget what ordinary Americans can accomplish when the stakes are high enough to demand their best.